Before there was an empire, before the rise of kings and queens, before the Union Jack flew across continents, there was only an island, wild, untamed, and divided. But from its ancient tribes to its global empire, from bloody civil wars to modern political revolutions, the United Kingdom has stood at the crossroads of history again and again. This is not just a story of royalty and wars. This is a story of people power, pride, and perseverance. Today, we dive into one of the most complex and fascinating journeys ever told, the entire history of the United Kingdom. From its tribal roots to Brexit and beyond, let's uncover how this small island shaped the world, and how the world, in turn, reshaped it. The story of the United Kingdom begins long before it became a unified state. It begins with the land itself, rich in forests, rivers, and rugged coastlines, shaped by the movements of ancient peoples and the forces of empires. Thousands of years ago, the island of Britain was inhabited by Celtic tribes. These were warrior societies organized into clans, each with its own customs, spiritual beliefs, and languages. They lived in hill forts and practiced a form of Druidism, a religious belief system connected to nature, the seasons, and ritual sacrifice. These tribes dominated the land until the arrival of the Romans in 43 AD. Under Emperor Claudius, Roman legions invaded southern Britain and gradually extended their control. The Roman conquest was brutal but efficient, introducing roads, cities, written records, and centralized governance. Londinium's modern-day London emerged as a critical trading center. Yet, the Roman occupation never conquered all the British Isles. In modern-day Scotland, the Picts resisted fiercely, and Hadrian's Wall was constructed to defend the Roman frontier from northern incursions. Roman rule lasted nearly 400 years, but by the early 5th century, the empire was weakening. As Roman legions withdrew to defend Rome from external threats, the British Isles were left vulnerable once again. This vacuum led to the rise of new invaders, the Anglo-Saxons. These were Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, who crossed the sea and began settling in Britain. Over time, they established small kingdoms such as Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. They displaced or assimilated the native Britons, driving many into Wales and Cornwall. The Anglo-Saxon period, often called the Heptarchy for its 7 main kingdoms, saw the development of Old English, new agricultural practices, and Christianization, particularly after the arrival of missionaries like St. Augustine in 597 AD. By the 9th century, these kingdoms were facing a new threat, Viking raids from Scandinavia. The Vikings brought devastation but also integration. Some settled permanently, especially in the Danelaw region in the north and east. A powerful Anglo-Saxon king, Alfred the Great of Wessex, resisted the Viking advance and laid the foundations for the idea of a united England. His successors gradually consolidated the Anglo-Saxon territories, and by the early 10th century, England began to emerge as a single political entity. But unification did not end conflict. The Vikings returned, and in 1016, King Cnut of Denmark briefly ruled over a North Sea empire including England. Anglo-Saxon rule was eventually restored, but in 1066, everything changed. The death of King Edward the Confessor without an heir led to a succession crisis. William, Duke of Normandy in modern-day France, claimed the throne and invaded England. At the Battle of Hastings, William defeated Harold Godwinson and became King William I, known as William the Conqueror. The Norman Conquest transformed England. The Normans brought a new aristocracy, French language influence, a centralized feudal system, and architectural marvels like castles and cathedrals. The Anglo-Norman identity became the foundation of medieval England. Meanwhile, other regions developed their own complex histories. In Scotland, the Picts and Gaels unified under Kenneth MacAlpin in the 9th century, forming the Kingdom of Alba. Over time, this kingdom expanded southward, absorbing other territories and resisting English domination. Wales remained fragmented among native principalities, constantly resisting English control. Ireland, composed of small kingdoms called Tutha, was similarly fragmented but rich in monastic learning and culture. By the 13th century, England began exerting influence over Wales and parts of Ireland. The conquest of Wales by Edward I in the late 1200s marked the beginning of English dominance in the region. He built a chain of massive stone castles and established English legal and administrative control. Ireland, on the other hand, was more resistant, and English control remained limited to the Pale, an area around Dublin, while the rest of the island stayed under Gaelic rule. Scotland remained fiercely independent and often allied with France against England. Attempts by English kings to assert authority over Scotland led to prolonged wars of independence. Figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce became national heroes in their struggle to keep Scotland free. Despite occasional alliances through marriage and diplomacy, the British Isles remained a patchwork of kingdoms and cultures. This early period, from the ancient Celts to the rise of Anglo-Saxon England and the assertion of Norman power, laid the cultural, political, and linguistic foundations for what would eventually become the United Kingdom. It was a story of invasion and resistance, unification and fragmentation, faith and warfare. Before there was a United Kingdom, there were many kingdoms, each with its own identity, myth, and struggle for survival. The birth of these kingdoms is not just a prelude, it is the backbone of British history. The evolution of the United Kingdom is deeply entwined with the history of monarchy, conflict, and political union. After the Norman Conquest of 1066, England entered a new era of kingship, where royal power was centralized, and the monarchy became the heart of political life. The Plantagenet dynasty, descending from the Normans, ruled England for over 300 years, but their reign was marked by frequent wars, both abroad and within. One of the earliest and most transformative moments came in 1215 when King John, under pressure from rebellious barons, was forced to sign the Magna Carta. This charter limited the absolute power of the monarch and laid the foundation for future parliamentary governance, establishing the principle that the king was not above the law. Though initially a peace treaty, the Magna Carta would become a powerful symbol of liberty and constitutional government. The 14th and 15th centuries saw England embroiled in the 100 Years' War with France, a dynastic struggle rooted in claims to the French throne. Though England won major battles like Agincourt under Henry V, the war ended in defeat, and England lost most of its French possessions. However, the war fueled a sense of English national identity, and the monarch's role as a unifying figure became more entrenched. Internally, the monarchy faced even greater turmoil during the Wars of the Roses of 1455–1487. A brutal civil conflict between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, both branches of the Plantagenet family. This dynastic war devastated the nobility and led to the eventual rise of the Tudor dynasty with Henry VI, who married Elizabeth of York to unify the warring factions. His son, Henry V, became one of England's most famous and controversial monarchs. Henry VI's reign marked a seismic shift in the relationship between the monarchy and religion. In his quest for a male heir, he broke from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, making himself its supreme head. This act not only initiated the English Reformation, but also gave the monarchy unprecedented religious and political control. His daughter Elizabeth I would later consolidate this religious transformation and usher in a golden age of culture, exploration, and relative internal stability. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 under Elizabeth's leadership bolstered national pride and affirmed England's place as a growing power. The question of succession resurfaced with Elizabeth's death in 1603, as she died childless. The English crown passed to her cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This moment created a personal union between the crowns of England and Scotland, though the two remained legally separate kingdoms. James I ruled over what he called Great Britain, but tensions between the monarchy and Parliament escalated during his reign and that of his son, Charles I. The 17th century brought civil war to the British Isles. Charles I's belief in the divine right of kings clashed with Parliament's demand for accountability and power sharing. The English Civil War 1642-1651 pitted royalists against parliamentarians and ended with Charles's execution, an unprecedented act in European monarchy. For a short time, England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth, though it eventually slid into authoritarian rule. The monarchy was restored in 1660 with Charles II, but the balance of power had shifted permanently. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, in which James Sickle was deposed and replaced by William and Mary, firmly established parliamentary supremacy. The Bill of Rights, 1689, restricted royal authority and laid the groundwork for a constitutional monarchy. This political transformation set the stage for the Acts of Union in the early 18th century. In 1707, England and Scotland formally united to form the Kingdom of Great Britain, driven by political pragmatism and economic necessity. The two parliaments merged, and the new state shared a single monarch government and economic policy, though Scotland retained its distinct legal and educational systems. In 1801, Ireland was brought into this union, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. This act was partly a response to the Irish Rebellion of 1798 and fears of French revolutionary influence. Yet, the union was never simple or universally accepted. While it created a powerful imperial state, it also sowed long-lasting divisions, particularly in Ireland, where resentment over Protestant domination and British control would simmer for more than a century. Throughout this period, monarchy and warfare defined not just political structures, but the identity of the people. The crown symbolized continuity in an age of upheaval. War, whether with France, with itself, or with subjects demanding more freedom, served as the crucible in which a more unified Britain was forged. Political unions were never purely harmonious, but they represented a historical necessity, born from blood, power struggles, and an evolving sense of nationhood. The path from feuding kingdoms to a single united kingdom was long, violent, and complex, but it became the backbone of the modern British state. The British Empire stands as one of the most vast and complex empires in human history, touching every corner of the globe and reshaping the modern world. Its roots can be traced back to the late 15th and early 16th centuries, when European nations began to explore and colonize lands beyond their borders. While Spain and Portugal initially dominated the age of discovery, England soon emerged as a major maritime and colonial power. Under the Tudor monarchs, particularly Elizabeth I, English sailors like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh set out on voyages that challenged Spanish dominance and laid the groundwork for overseas expansion. In the 17th century, England began to establish its first permanent colonies. Jamestown, founded in 1607 in present-day Virginia, became the first successful English settlement in North America. This was soon followed by other colonies along the eastern seaboard, in the Caribbean, and later in Africa and Asia. The establishment of the East India Company in 1600 marked the beginning of a vast commercial enterprise that would eventually control large parts of the Indian subcontinent. Trade, especially in valuable commodities such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and spices, fueled the rapid growth of English and later British global influence. The empire was not built peacefully. It was forged through war, conquest, exploitation, and slavery. The transatlantic slave trade became a cornerstone of Britain's economic power. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and transported to the Americas in brutal conditions. British merchants, ships, and financiers played a central role in this system, reaping enormous profits at a terrible human cost. The wealth generated by slave labor enriched British cities, funded industrial development, and strengthened the empire's foundations. The 18th century marked the rise of the so-called First British Empire, focused primarily on the Americas and the Caribbean. British colonies in North America grew rapidly, with settlers establishing new towns, farms, and trade routes. However, tensions between the colonies and the British government eventually led to conflict. The American Revolution, beginning in 1775, resulted in the loss of the 13 colonies by 1783. This was a major blow to the empire, but it did not spell its end. Instead, Britain shifted its attention to other parts of the world, especially Asia. The East India Company expanded its power in India, taking advantage of the declining Mughal Empire and regional rivalries. By the early 19th century, it had become the de facto ruler of vast territories in the Indian subcontinent. Following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British government dissolved the company and assumed direct control over India, establishing the British Raj. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a central hub for trade, military power, and administration. Meanwhile, Britain's influence in Africa, the Pacific, and the Middle East was growing. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand became settler colonies with large populations of British immigrants and increasing self-governance. In Africa, Britain took part in the so-called Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, seizing control of territories from Egypt to South Africa. These conquests were justified with ideologies like the civilizing mission and social Darwinism, which claimed that it was Britain's duty to bring civilization and progress to lesser peoples. In reality, empire often meant exploitation, cultural erasure, and political domination. The Victorian era marked the height of the British Empire. By 1900, Britain controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's landmass and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. London was the financial and political heart of this global empire, and English became the language of power, education, and commerce across continents. British law institutions and customs were imposed on diverse societies, often at the expense of local traditions and autonomy. The empire was a source of pride for many Britons, seen as a symbol of national greatness and divine favor. But it was also a source of resistance. Across the empire, movements for self-rule and independence began to grow. In Ireland, India, Africa, and the Caribbean, people began to challenge British rule through protest, writing, and revolution. These resistance movements would eventually lead to the empire's unraveling in the 20th century. Still, during its peak, the British Empire had a profound impact on global history. It spread ideas, technology, religion, and systems of governance. It created global trade networks and forged connections between distant peoples and regions. But it also caused immense suffering, displacement, and injustice. The legacy of empire is deeply complicated, both a story of global ambition and a record of domination. Empire and colonization were not just chapters in Britain's past. They were defining forces that shaped the identity of the United Kingdom and the modern world. The rise of the British Empire turned a once fragmented island nation into a global superpower, but at a cost that is still being reckoned with today. The 20th century began with the British Empire at its height, ruling over a vast and diverse range of territories across every inhabited continent. It was a time of imperial pride, economic dominance, and political power. But beneath the surface, tensions, both at home and abroad, were brewing. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 would mark the beginning of a profound transformation, not only in global geopolitics, but also in Britain's position in the world. The war revealed the vulnerability of even the greatest empires and sowed the seeds for the eventual decline of British imperial dominance. When war erupted in Europe, Following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Britain entered the conflict as part of the Allied powers. The war quickly evolved into a brutal and prolonged trench conflict, unlike anything seen before. Britain mobilized millions of men from across the empire, India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Africa, to fight alongside its own troops. The global nature of the war underscored the reach of the British Empire, but it also highlighted the costs. Over 700,000 British soldiers died and countless more were wounded. The economic toll was staggering. Britain borrowed heavily, and its financial dominance gave way to a new global creditor, the United States. Despite being on the victorious side in 1918, the First World War deeply wounded Britain. It had lost a generation of young men, and the empire's unity was beginning to show cracks. In Ireland, rising demands for independence led to the Irish War of Independence, 1919-1921, resulting in the partition of the island and the creation of the Irish Free State, marking one of the first major breakaways from the empire. Similar aspirations were beginning to stir in India, where leaders like Mahatma Gandhi launched non-violent campaigns for self-rule. The interwar years were marked by economic hardship, political instability, and a growing sense of disillusionment with war. Yet, only 2 decades after the Great War, the world was plunged into an even more devastating conflict. In 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany after its invasion of Poland, beginning the Second World War. This time, Britain stood largely alone in the early years, especially after France fell in 1940. The Blitz, Nazi Germany's bombing campaign against Britain, brought the horrors of war to the civilian population. Cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool were heavily bombed, and the war demanded total national mobilization. Winston Churchill's leadership during this time became iconic. His speeches rallied the British people, and his alliance with the United States and the Soviet Union helped form the backbone of the Allied resistance. Britain again drew on the strength of its empire, with millions from the colonies contributing to the war effort. Indian soldiers, African regiments, and Commonwealth forces played key roles in battles from North Africa to Burma. However, the war left Britain economically drained. Its cities were battered, its industries strained, and its empire increasingly restless. The post-war period marked a sharp decline in Britain's global dominance. Although victorious, Britain had lost its superpower status. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the new global powers, and the world shifted into the Cold War era. Economically dependent on American loans and aid, Britain began the painful process of decolonization. The most symbolic and significant moment came in 1947, when India, the jewel of the empire, gained independence, followed by Pakistan. This marked the beginning of a wave of decolonization that swept through Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean over the next 3 decades. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Britain withdrew from colonies it had held for over a century. Ghana gained independence in 1957, followed by Nigeria, Kenya, and a host of others. The process was not always peaceful. In places like Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising against colonial rule was met with brutal suppression. In the Middle East, Britain was drawn into conflicts like the Suez Crisis of 1956, which ended in political embarrassment and further demonstrated its reduced global influence. At home, the war had also changed British society. The shared sacrifice led to demands for a more equal and just nation. The Labour government of 1945 introduced sweeping reforms, including the creation of the National Health Service, expansion of social housing, and nationalization of key industries. Britain was becoming a modern welfare state, even as its empire faded. By the end of the 20th century, the British Empire had largely dissolved, replaced by the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations, many of which retained cultural and historical ties to Britain. The memory of the empire still lingered in the language, legal systems, and institutions of many former colonies, but Britain was no longer the imperial power it once was. The world wars, especially the Second, did not just drain Britain's resources, they reshaped its identity. The collapse of empire forced the British people to reckon with a new role in the world, not as rulers of a global domain, but as a mid-sized nation seeking its place in a new, post-colonial, multipolar order. The wars marked the end of an era and the beginning of a long and often painful transformation from empire to nation. The post-imperial era ushered in a new chapter for the United Kingdom, a chapter marked by reinvention, internal tension, and global recalibration. As the empire dissolved, Britain was left to grapple with its new identity, no longer the world's ruling power, but still a nation of considerable influence. The second half of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st became a time of political transformation, cultural change, and growing questions about the UK's unity and role in the modern world. After the decline of empire, Britain sought to re-establish its global significance through other alliances, chief among them the European Economic Community, EEC, which it joined in 1973. This move was both economic and political. Britain, struggling with inflation, industrial decline, and labor unrest, saw the EEC as a chance to integrate into a rising European bloc and maintain relevance in a world increasingly dominated by the Cold War powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Over time, the EEC evolved into the European Union's EU, a deeper political and economic union that Britain always approached with a degree of skepticism. Though a member, Britain refused to adopt the euro and often resisted deeper political integration, reflecting a national reluctance to surrender sovereignty. Meanwhile, back home, British society was undergoing a profound transformation. Immigration from former colonies in the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa brought new cultural vibrancy and new tensions. Cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester became multicultural centers, home to communities with roots across the world. The rise of a multicultural Britain brought both celebration and conflict, as race relations, integration, and identity became major themes in national discourse. At the same time, traditional industries like coal mining and manufacturing declined, leading to economic hardship in the North and Midlands, even as London evolved into a global financial powerhouse. Politically, the 1980s were dominated by Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government, which reshaped the British economy through privatization, deregulation, and the weakening of trade unions. Her policies were deeply divisive, credited with modernizing the economy, but also blamed for increasing inequality and social unrest. The 1990s brought Labour back to power under Tony Blair, whose New Labour project aimed to balance economic liberalism with social justice. Blair's government invested in public services and oversaw peace in Northern Ireland through the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, a landmark that brought relative peace after decades of sectarian violence known as the Troubles. Yet, the question of Britain's internal unity never fully disappeared. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland began demanding more control over their own affairs. Devolution in the late 1990s created separate parliaments or assemblies for each nation, except England, giving them authority over education, health, and other domestic issues. Scotland, in particular, began to push for greater independence. In 2014, a referendum was held in which 55% of Scots voted to remain in the UK, but the momentum for eventual separation did not disappear. Then came Brexit, the most seismic political shift in modern British history. In 2016, the UK held a referendum on whether to remain in the European Union. The result shocked the world. 52% voted to leave. The vote revealed deep divisions between cities and towns, young and old, England and Scotland, and between different visions of Britain's future. Some saw Brexit as a reclaiming of national sovereignty and democratic control. Others viewed it as a retreat from global cooperation and a self-inflicted wound. The years following the referendum were turbulent. Governments fell, negotiations dragged on, and the country faced political paralysis. Eventually, the UK officially left the EU in 2020. The effects were immediate and complex: trade disruptions, labour shortages, and renewed tension in Northern Ireland, where the post-Brexit border arrangements challenged the delicate peace established by the Good Friday Agreement. Meanwhile, Scotland began pushing again for a second independence referendum, arguing that it had voted overwhelmingly to stay in the EU and had been taken out against its will. Culturally and socially, the UK continued to evolve. Debates over immigration, identity, and race gained momentum, especially after global movements like Black Lives Matter found resonance in Britain. Statues of slave traders were pulled down. Institutions began to reckon more openly with their colonial past. At the same time, British music, fashion, and media retained global appeal, and the monarchy, despite scandals and generational change, remained a symbol of continuity. In 2022, the death of Queen Elizabeth II ended a reign that had lasted 70 years and symbolized the UK's transition from empire to modern state. Her passing marked the end of an era. Her son, King Charles II, assumed the throne in a country very different from the one his mother inherited. A country no longer imperial, no longer part of the European Union, and unsure of its own internal unity. Modern Britain stands at a crossroads. It is a nation seeking to redefine itself, balancing history and heritage with diversity and change. Its future remains uncertain. Questions about the monarchy's relevance, Scotland's independence, and its global role post-Brexit all loom large. But Britain has weathered centuries of transformation before. What comes next will depend not on reclaiming past glories, but on building a future shaped by inclusion, innovation, and honest reflection on what it means to be a united kingdom in a fragmented world.